In my previous video, I showed step by step how I set the lights to recreate a scene from the movie Blade Runner. If you missed it, you can find the link of the video in the description. Today, I'm gonna try to replicate the color grade process, moving from this digital image to this cinematic result. In my project settings, I set DaVinci YRGB as color science, DaVinci Intermediate as timeline color space, and Rec 709A as output color space, because I'm working on a Mac display. In my Raw tab, I select Clip as decoding method, color space Rec 709, Gamma Rec 709. If you want to know why I choose these settings for the Canon EOS M, I explained it in another video, which link I put in the description. Now I'm gonna create a serial node in which I apply a color space transform to send my camera color space to a wide color space and gamma, which will be my working color space. I'm gonna set my input color space and gamma the same I set in my Raw tab, Rec 709, and as output color space and gamma, DaVinci. Then I set the tone mapping to none. Let's create a new node and label it CST out. I apply a color space transform. This time, instead of moving the footage from DaVinci to Rec 709, being that the LUT that I'm gonna use is designed for Blackmagic, I'll move the clip from the DaVinci color space to the Blackmagic color space. Then, after my CST out node, I create a new node where I apply an Eastman film emulation from Phantom LUT developed for the Pocket 4K. After that, I create a compound node with my two nodes and I label it Film Print Emulation. So, in my working color space, I create a node for the exposure. I increase the exposure using the HDR global wheel. Then, I create another node for the contrast. And I lower the shadow to -10 in my log wheel. I create another serial node for the balance, and in my HDR wheel, I push the global toward cyan and the light toward orange. Then I create a parallel node. I feed it from my first node and I add a serial node to it. I'm gonna change the color space of this first node to HSL. Then, I disable the hue and luminance channel, leaving active only the saturation channel. And I label this node as HSL. After that, in the following node, I change the color space to HSV, and again, I disable the hue and value channel, leaving active only the saturation channel. Then, in the HSL node, I lower the gain in my primaries to 0.58, and in my HSV node, I raise the gamma and the gain. Finally, I created a compound node with these two nodes, and I labeled it saturation. Doing that, I try to mimic the behavior of the saturation in a film print system. If we split the screen, the skin tone of the original scene are more orangey. So, I'll take several steps to get closer to that tone. First, I'm gonna create a new pipeline fed directly from the first node, which will help to qualify the skin tone. My first node is for the exposure, and because it doesn't have any output to our display, to see it, I turn on the highlight button. Then, I increase the exposure using the HDR global wheel. I create a new serial node for the contrast. And this time, I'm gonna use my primaries wheels, playing with gain, gamma, and lift. After that, I create a node for the saturation. I raise it up to 100. And a node for the balance, pushing the color toward the green cyan quadrant in the offset wheel. Now I create a node for qualifying the skin tone and I connect the RGB output of my secondary pipeline to the key input of my qualifying node. Now that I qualified the skin, I'm gonna change the tone using the HDR wheels. In my globals, I push the color toward orange, I raise the exposure of the darks, and push the color toward red. Then I lower the global saturation. Then I create a compound node with my adjustments and I label the nodes. After that, I create two nodes after my parallel nodes. In the first one, I'm gonna use the RGB mixer, setting under the blue channel, blue to 0 and green to 1. Then, in the following node, I'm gonna change my hue to 43. I create a compound node with these two nodes and I label it RGB mix. Then, after my last node, I create a node to give the last touch to the skin tones. As I said, this took me several steps. After doing my qualification, I create a mask to isolate the subject and track it. Now, with my HDR wheels, I try to get as close as possible to the skin tone I'm looking for. Let's see if we are close. Comparing the two images, I need to give another little touch. With the key control, I'm gonna lower the key output of the RGB mix node to 0.6. Much better. Now I create a new node to apply a glow effect. I change the composite type to soft light, then I lower the threshold to 0.01, spread to 0.6, gamma 1.05, saturation to 0.2 and opacity to 0.4. Off, on, off, on. Sean Young, the actress who played the replicant in the 80s film, was 23 at the time. My wife is 45 years old, so I did some minor touch-ups. I create a new node applying the face refinement effect. As operating mode, I used Beauty Advanced. Diffuse lighting 0.6, eye sharpening 0.8, eye light 0.05, and eye bag removal 0.3. Off, on. Then I create a new node to add more density to the reds using the DCTL plugin. Off, on. Let's label the nodes. I added a new node to create a power window in order to highlight the light beam. And I use the curves to lower the shadows and the midtones. If we look at the images and the waveform, my blacks are more open than the original, and with the tone tending more towards magenta. Can you see that? So, to correct this issue, I create a node where I qualify only the darkest parts of the image using the luminance with the HSL tool. Then, with a mask, I isolate only the part of my interest. I split the viewer to match easily the two images, and using the curves, I'm gonna work separately on each channel in the darks part, rising a little bit the blue channel, and lowering a little bit the green and red channels. Before, after. Now, in my film print emulation compound node, I'm gonna add two new nodes between the CST node and the LUT node. So, for the texture that I want to achieve, I add grain in one node, pointing it more on midtones and less on the shadows and the highlights. And I do it using the HSL qualifier, targeting mainly the midtones. I set the grain size to 0.7, aspect ratio 1.3, strength 0.25, softness 0.4, and global blend 0.8. Before, after. Then, in my other node, I add blur, changing gamma to linear. And I raise the radius blur to 0.57. Before, after. Finally, at the beginning of my nodes tree, I added a node for the noise reduction. I set temporal noise reduction to 3, motion estimation type, better, and temporal threshold, 6. So, it's all. Let's see the final result, and thanks so much for watching.